Hi everyone, I am here today to do the historical fiction book tag. This book tag was actually created by Penguin Teen and I was tagged by Kassidy Voinche. So the first question is, why do you like to read historical fiction? Now I could go on for ages, and I mean ages, about this topic. Basically, when I was younger, like really young at school, I really enjoyed learning about the ancient Egyptians, the Romans, then like as time went on, the Tudors, the Victorians. I was really obsessed with just reading non-fiction books back then about like anything and everything I could to sort of teach me more. It was only as I got into my teens that I realised there's such a thing as historical fiction. So you can have a really good thrilling story, or like a heartbreaking story or something interesting, and yet still get access to some of this information which may or may not be totally accurate, but all the same makes a really sort of interesting and less dry reading. So yeah, I read historical fiction to broaden my knowledge while having a good time. Question 2. What was the first historical fiction book you read? I think, and I'm not 100% because I never used to track my reading when I was younger, which really irritates me now. I really wish I had from like the moment I started reading, but never mind. I think it was Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. Now this is mainly a war novel and it starts just before the First World War, but then the story carries right on through to... Yeah, the last part is 1979 and I had to read this for school. Being faced with that, I was like, oh no, this looks quite dull. It's pretty long with a pretty small font. This is gonna be grueling and dull. I had the complete opposite experience. I thought that this was absolutely fantastic, and it was my, as I say, I think it was my first taste at proper historical fiction, and it just totally pulled me in. It had me crying at times. There's some explicit scenes in this from what I remember, even though I've not read this since, and I was about 14 maybe at the time, maybe younger than that, I'm not sure. But yeah, this was just the first door to my then historical fiction journey. So the next question is, where do you draw the line for historical fiction and contemporary? And I feel like this is a really tricky one. Like at first when I was looking through the questions, I was thinking that I'd be able to mention Revival by Stephen King in this tag somewhere, because that starts in the 1960s. But it does go all the way through to present day, so I've not actually mentioned that book anywhere, and I find it really tricky. I'd say it depends on kind of what the book's even meant to be about to some extent, but probably the 90s is probably where you'd start swapping to contemporary. It's a very grey area and something that everyone will feel differently about. So have you read a book set in each of these eras? So there's the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1920s to 30s, the 1940s to 50s, and the 1960s. And there is only one era that I haven't read from, and that is the 1700s. So to mention the 1600s first, I have got The Ashes of London by Andrew Taylor, and I've literally just finished reading this morning. And this is set in 1666 in England during the, well, sort of the aftermath of the Fire of London, which I thought was like a really interesting area to go in terms of time, because it's one of my favourite times to read about, because, yeah, I used to love reading about the plague and the Fire of London, so it's set around that time, so that was just up my street time period wise. Next we have got the only Philippa Gregory book that I have ever read, which I feel like is a crime considering how much I love historical fiction, but that is The Other Billing Girl, and it's been ages since I've read this, absolutely ages. This one starts in 1521 and is set during Tudor England, which was another one of my favourite times to read about. And so this was, at the time that I was reading it, quite a struggle for me, because again, really big, really tiny font. Who says fantasy are the only chunker books? Honestly, some historical fiction can be really chunky. But yeah, I want to read more Philippa Gregory. I own a lot more Philippa Gregory and I will be getting around to them hopefully one day. In the meantime though, I highly recommend this one. I really enjoyed it, even though I struggled with it back at the time that I read it. So to move on to the 1800s, the next book I want to talk about is A Dark and Distant Shore by Ray Tannehill. I've not got a physical copy of this one right now because I lent it to a friend a few years ago and she's still reading it. No, if you're watching this, I know you are still reading it, you're just slow. It took me several months to get through this one as well, to be honest, because it was really, really chunky again with really small font again, and was quite heavy at times and quite difficult to just sit and read for big periods of time. So this was set from 1803 to 1903, mainly in Scotland, and follows an entire century of this woman's life and all of her family and all of the things that happen within that family. And it was really gripping, heart-wrenching, heavy, as I already said. Like, it was, for want of a better word, it really was quite a journey. The next book is House of Silence by Sarah Barthel, and this one's set in 1875, and this one covers what it was like to live then. You basically were set up for marriage with, like, if you were a woman, you were set up for marriage with a specific man, and the character in this novel doesn't want to marry this man. He is a bad man from what I remember. It's been a little while since I've read it, but he's not someone that she wants to be with. And so she tries to get away from him and not be with him, and ends up in a sort of institution because they think that she's crazy, basically. And she's making herself appear that way because that's the only way that she feels she can escape from having to marry this man. And it's just really insightful, and it was a really, again, gripping but heart-wrenching at times read. So next we jump to the 1920s and 30s, and the first book I want to mention here is slightly cheating a little bit, as it is historical fiction but it's also paranormal, and that is The Diviners by Libba Bray, which is set in the 1920s in New York. So you've got all the flappers and everything going on, and it makes for a really interesting sort of time period to read about, because I didn't really know much about the flappers and all that sort of time period. So while having all the paranormal stuff on the side, you have still got a good bit of historical fiction in there. Next we have The Tea Planter's Wife by Dinah Jeffries. Again, this is set in the 1920s originally. I think time passes all the way through to like maybe the 40s, maybe even the 60s, I can't remember. But a lot of time passes in this book, and it's set mainly in, I can't remember where, but a foreign country on a tea plantation. And you do get a little bit of London, I think, at the beginning of the book, and I think there's a bit in New York at one point as well, but it's just a really different read. I've never read a book set somewhere so different, and the twists and turns that book took me on were really quite something. Next we have the 1940s and 50s, and the book I want to mention for that is Bertie the Blitz Dog by Libby Parker. This was adorable. Look at that cover anyway. That cover alone is adorable. But this book is from the perspective of a dog during the Blitz in London, and honestly, hands down, for creativity, this book is there. Next we have the 1960s, and I've got This Little Piggy by Faye Davenport. I read this one a few years ago. I can't remember an awful lot about it other than it being set somewhere in northern England, and it was set during some like miners' strike. That is in there, along with sort of like a bit of intrigue upon like crime and like there being some sort of journalist thing. As you can tell, I don't remember this one well enough to fill you in properly, but I did really enjoy it back at the time, and I do highly recommend it. So question 5 is, what's the last historical fiction book you read? And as I mentioned earlier, that was The Ashes of London by Andrew Taylor. And I'm now about to start the sequel to that, which is The Fire Court. I am really excited to get into this one, because from the reviews, people are saying that it's better than The Ashes of London, which I did really enjoy. And I would recommend if you're into that period of time, but it was really quite dry in places and not always that easy to get through, but the end was total worthy payoff. So yeah, I'm going to be picking this one up later today, and by the time you're watching this video, it'll probably be the most recent book that I will have finished. And these books are historical thrillers, so they're sort of combining my historical fiction obsession with my thriller obsession, which is just fantastic. Next, what's your favourite historical fiction cover? I've already mentioned earlier how much I adore this cover, and that is Bertie the Blitz Dog. That cover, adorable, yet says everything that you want to know about the book. And question 7 is, what's your favourite historical fiction? I can't answer that. I literally cannot answer that. Every book I've mentioned in this video could be down for that. I mean, this one because it's got a journalist in, and when I was younger I wanted to be a journalist. This one because it's the first historical fiction I ever picked up, and it took me on quite a eye-opening journey into historical fiction. This one because it's set in Tudor times and I love reading about the Tudors. We could have A Dark and Distant Shore because it spans an entire life. Bertie the Blitz Dog because it's great for kids, in like getting kids into historical fiction, and it's just really creative and educational at the same time and really gripping and had me hooked. For atmosphere and twists, we could have The Tea Planter's Wife. Like, any of the books I mentioned could easily be covered here. I don't want to pick one because it would vary on my mood and what sort of historical fiction book I want to recommend as being my favourite. And so instead I've cheated a little bit here, and I've wrote down instead my favourite time periods. So my favourite time periods to read about would be the 15 and 1600s and Victorian England, and that is my cheating answer, and we are done. So thank you so much for watching this video. I'm not going to tag anyone because I don't really know. Well, I do know some people that I'm friends with that are into historical fiction, but I don't know whether they'd want to do this tag. Tags are one of those things that you tag people to do and then they feel bad about not doing them. I don't want someone to feel bad for, like, in a year's time thinking, oh no, I never filmed that tag. So yeah, if you watch this and you really enjoy historical fiction and want to film it, then do so and let me know so that I can watch it. So yeah. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe by clicking the image of me somewhere if you want to see more book reviews and other bookish content from me, and I will see you soon. Bye bye!